dear professors, dear guests, and some other people whom I did not actually give you about their whereabouts and about who they are, but I feel myself obliged to express my gratitudes. And of course, my special thanks will directly go to Associated Professor Süleyman Kasap and his team for organizing such a kind of convention, which I not only I myself, but everybody believes will pave the way for an adequate understanding of the topics discussed for the past couple of days to not only the academic imagination, but also to the public imagination. So, in the past couple of days, the speeches made, manifestations made, and the things discussed on a wide range of topics by different kinds of people coming from different geographies of the world are actually of greater prominence, and I will just try to touch on some of the points which they made quite zestfully and enthusiastically, and you can also sense such a kind of enthusiasm from my speech at the moment. Yesterday, in one of the breaks of our conference, I have confided some of the poetic pieces in some of the friends coming from Hungary by trying to make a reference to some of the American poet whose name will be quite well understood, well recognized by every person here, by Edgar Allan Poe in one of his famous short pieces, The Full House Usher. Today, early in the morning, when I woke up, when I got up from my sleep, I tried to come here in time, but due to some of the inconveniences, I have actually lost half an hour of period. I have become late for half an hour of the period of the starting time of the conference. When I was coming, just as it was mentioned in that famous piece of short story written by Edgar Allan Poe, I was thinking about in the whole world, dark and rainy and sunless day, in the not autumn of the year, but in the summer of the year, when the clouds were hanging oppressively low in the heavens. I have been passing along in a melancholic way and trying to understand what in these 3 days of our activities were discussed and what would be best for me to overemphasize, to make stress about. The thing which before I came here, I wanted to make a stress about was the benefits, the cons and the pros of technological use in our pedagogical processes, in our educational environments, so on and so forth. Of course, I have got no absolutist, I do not adopt any kind of absolutist argument rejecting totally the technological use in our educational environments. But I have always stressed, since the advent of the internet, since the advent of the information and communication technologies, I, together with most of my friends, have adopted a point of view partially supporting the beneficial aspects of the communication or information technologies. We do not actually have any kind of perspective either absolutely rejecting technological use in our educational environments or trying to dehumanize, catastrophic dehumanization of technologies. Now, you will not misunderstand, I hope, me when I try to touch on some of the forms of the technological use in our pedagogical environments. As I told you, most of life is actually very much dull. It is so dull that, as it was quite elegantly expressed by some of the novelists of English literature, that famous novelist, whose name was Ian Forster, in one of his famous novelistic pieces, a passage to India. On one occasion, in one of the chapters of the book, he says that most of life is actually so dull that there is nothing to be said about it. In the past couple of days of our activities of our convention, I can't help confessing to you that most of the talks and most of the activities made actually became not only exaggerated, especially in my imagination, but in the imagination of most of our friends. The reason most of the discussions about various topics became doomed to be failure was because there is a dichotomy between the real and the virtual spaces. As I told you in one of our yesterday's sessions, a very famous psychologist, actually neuroscientist in Oxford University, Professor Susan Greenfield, in the past couple of years, she is reiterating some of the manifestations about the cause, about the bad impacts of the technological use in our two-dimensional virtual environments characterizing the 21st century. The three dimension is unfortunately devoid. The three dimension of any kind of phenomenology has totally been devoid in the two-dimensional virtual spaces. This is having some of the impacts. One of the impacts which has been overemphasized by a slate of neuroscientists in Harvard, recently in the University of California, for example, a group of scientists made a manifesto saying that, for example, there is a mind change on the part of our students, on the part of our adolescents. There is a mind change which has become as preposterous, as dangerous, as unprecedented as climate change. Did I go and fetch a falling star, get this is one of the pieces of poetry which was manifested by some of the English poets. Go and catch a falling star, get me child and one great fruit. Of course, technological advances, scientific explorations made some of the states of affairs in our educational environments to be very easily conducted, to be quite welcomed by us, by almost 100% of us. But one of the physiological, neurobiological detriments which have been brought to the daylight by the neuroscientists is the fact that compared with the past couple of thousands of years, human cognition is unfortunately getting lower and lower day by day. Of course, up until 90s, there should be mentioned, or there could be mentioned, some of the higher level of cognition or higher level of intelligence on the part of the populations of the world. But unfortunately, a manifesto which was made by tens of scientists, very eminent scientists, in Oxford, in Harvard, in the University of California, as far as I remember, last year, such a manifesto has been made, which stressed, which overemphasized a global decline in intelligence. There is a global decline in intelligence due to the fact that we have been devoid to the three-dimensional virtual environments. In the last session and in some other sessions, in the last 2 or 3 days, some of our friends also made some emphasis upon such kinds of phenomena, such kinds of facts. Ladies and gentlemen, dear professors, and some other people who I do not know, of course, just as it was mentioned by some of the eminent theologians in Harvard University, Harvard course, about whom we a little bit talked with some of our friends, some of our professors, Mustafa Hilmi yesterday. He, on one occasion, says that many people up until 40 years ago, were counting on the false promise of modernity. Many people were counting, many people were counting on the false promise of modernity and saying that as we progress, mankind will attain prosperity and human flourishing. Now, that actually has not been the case. Mankind is not going to flourish due to the fact that some threats being brought by the information overload, which also is having some other range of different kinds of bad impacts about our neurobiology, but some other things, like, for example, sedentary way of life, on the part of society, on the part of the individuals, is also contributing to some of the existential crisis, let alone the cognitive decline. But some existential crises are on the horizon. some existential crisis, existential delusion is unfortunately quivering on the horizon. The false promise of modernity, as I told you, was adopted. The progressivist version of history, Mr. Sandberg, the progressivist version of history was being adopted, supported by most of the modernists, by 99% of the modernists. And as I told you, they were of the conviction that as mankind progressed, we would not only attain prosperity, but a brave new world would be established. A brave new world would be established. Just as it was the case in some of the musical composition which was recently published in the days of the coronavirus. Before coronavirus broke out, people were actually overestimating the consequences, the debilitating consequences of the disease. So in France, some of the musical composition belonging to the famous composer, Davetli. His famous composition named Bolero was published on the internet. Yes, as far as I remember, 2 or 3 months ago, or a couple of months ago, such a kind of publication of the musical composition belonging to Mehmet was published, and only 1 or 2 minutes of period I am going to invite you to eavesdrop. I am going to invite you to eavesdrop. Just as part of the realizations we are working, far from any kind of scientific or technological talk which is every bit imposing upon our mind some impasse. Could you please listen to 1 or 2 minutes of that piece of composition which can be signified, which could be signified in your imagination, just as it was the case in the first days of coronavirus. The whole world underestimated the debilitating effects of the virus, and when the technological progresses made some false promises, the modernity made some false promises, everybody was counting upon some of the brand new world picture of mankind. Unfortunately, it did not come true. Yes, there was certain technological inconvenience. I am going to
Je suis ancien d'ingénieur.
Je suis Jean-Raymond, comment lui évoquer Didier Benetti.
Je m'appelle Jessica, Laurence Nader.
Grand favor de l'eau, Cyril Fils.
Nathalie Chabot.
Le transformeur.
Je m'appelle Marie-Jo.
This part of conversation is inducing a sense of enjoyment, a sense of tranquility. Such a kind of signification or symbolization was made by some of the artists. This kind of signification or symbolization was made by some of the artists. In that, humanity underestimated some of the bad impacts of technological catastrophe. Everything is not there. After 1 minute, please try to withdraw. some of the catastrophic impacts of some of the things which might occur in a near future. The rotating effect of pandemic is appearing on the horizon, and the rotating of the technological catastrophe or scientific unproductive, counterproductive effects of science and technology is appearing on the horizon. The orchestration is becoming much more complex. The state of the affairs of the world is getting much more chaotic compared with the tranquilities, with the peaceful epochs, peaceful period of human history. The peaceful periods or epochs of human history unfortunately became tarnished, became not only tarnished but also degenerated. So in quantum neuroscience, there is a real universally acknowledged in quantum neurosciences, there is an unchangeable view which is acknowledged universally that as human beings are accumulating legacies, epistemic legacies, whatsoever legacy you can imagine, as human beings are accumulating whatsoever utterances under the sun, gökmenin altında konuşmalar varsa, whatsoever utterances, whatsoever occurrences happened or uttered under the sun by human beings is contributing to the accumulation, unfortunately, best described as chaotic. And accumulation best described as complex and chaotic, which is making the life on earth not only difficult but challenging. Not only difficult but challenging. As I told you in the inauguration, in the beginning of my speech, I am not totally trying to adopt an absolutist approach to technology, but just as it was delicately put forth by that famous existential philosopher Martin Heidegger in 1950s. Technology is bringing about totalization in education. Totalization in education is one of the detrimental impacts our pupils are facing, Richard. Totalization in education, which is a term, a concept made by the famous philosopher Martin Heidegger, is unfortunately getting the state of affairs in pedagogies, in the global pedagogies, much more complex, and this complexity, to talk or to give you an example, in the second law of thermodynamics, this complexity is bringing about construction, annihilation, death, diminution, and unpredictability, of course. Unpredictability is being brought out by entropic effects of the second law of thermodynamics, which is quite appreciated and quite known by physical sciences. In physical sciences, actually, I do not want to talk into the state of affairs of our ability and entropy or a complexity, but rather on a dialectical basis, it will be very kind of you if you try to dredge up some of the things, some of the feelings, dredge up, if you would dredge up some of the things that would make me delve deep into the state of affairs which we are focusing upon. From now on, you are free to intrude in the affairs in my speech and even to interrupt me. From now on, you are quite free even to interrupt me on a civilizational context, as we yesterday talked about with our friend Richard Peterson. Let us take an example, the state of the activities conducted here in the past couple of days in our Congress. I can tell you that the things which we predicted and expected did not come true. Just as it was in the case of the false promises of modernity, which did not come true. Mentioned, as it was delicately mentioned by Harvard Post, that theology and theology. Do you think, before you came here, do you think most of your expectations were fulfilled, or I can make a confession that 10% of my expectations even did not come true, except for probably this venerable group of our friends and this venerable friend of ours who made his best for an adequate understanding of all of these phenomena to be understood and appreciated. I think you were about to tell something because there was a behavior popping out, all the things to be honest. Yes, Mustafa Bey, Professor Mustafa Bey, who is a professor, graduated from Bahçesi University, and who is at the moment working in Sosyal Bilimleri University Social Sciences. University of Social Sciences, yes.
I had a quick question actually. When you refer to any cause and saying that modernism's promises did not come true. What was the reason for that? Like if we do not understand the reason for why the modernist project failed, we will not be able to establish something more hopeful, if at all possible. So what was wrong with modernism in that respect, in your opinion? If I'm allowed to ask the question, I know.
The question put forth by Mustafa Hilmi is...
Hocam Mustafa Hilmi de mesleği. Mustafa değil. Bir de Ahmet koyarsanız ne olur?
The question put forth by Professor has been so delicately answered by that famous Harvard theologian, Harvey Coase, a couple of years ago, and I am going to invite you to listen just 1 or 2 minutes, just 1 or 2 minutes, to listen the original speech which he made on a television interview, which was appreciated by many scientists and philosophers, believe me.
You're listening to Podcast. I'm Şehrivan. In 1882, Friedrich Nietzsche wrote famously, "God is dead," but perhaps he was a bit short-sighted.
In 1982, Friedrich Nietzsche famously said that God is dead, but he was a little bit short-sighted. Kısa görüşlüydü.
For today, existentialism has gone away, but God has made rather a dramatic comeback.
For in these days, it is existentialism that is rather in the way. To be in the way, personnel yüz durmak. For today, it is rather existentialism that is in the way. But rather, God has made a dramatic comeback. God has made a
In
dramatic
this era of megachurches, madrasas, and meditation retreats, are we witnessing the birth of a new spirituality in a postmodern world? Or is this just a blip, a hiccup, a nostalgic detour? How profound is this religiosity, and how powerful is it? How persuasive? To answer these questions, I turned to the eminent theologian, Harvey Coase. Harvey, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So what's causing all of this, Harvey? Where is this burst of religiousness coming from?
Well, I think probably what's at the root of it is the disenchantment and disappointment that many people have experienced with what I would call the promise of modernity, perhaps the over-promise.
It is the disenchantment and the disappointment of what I call the promise of modernity, the disenchantment, the disappointment on the part of philosophers, on the part of scientists, which was made on the false promise of modernity.
That science and technology and education and literacy are all going to move us along toward a great new world.
Literacy, education, technology, and scientific developments would all move us to what kind of world? To a prosperous world, to a good world, to a reigning world.
And this did not happen. 50 years ago, many people were counting on that sort of inevitable progress theory of history.
Up to 30 years ago, many people were counting on the progress version of the history.
And also suggesting that as we progressed, perhaps religion would become more marginal or diminishing.
They said that as we progressed, perhaps religion would be marginal and of diminishing significance. To be of diminishing significance. Yes.
Of diminishing significance. And certainly religion did not become of diminishing significance, but all the promises and hopes and expectations, some of them false expectations, turned out not to happen. And so there's a lot of disappointment, frustration, and with all of the solutions that have been offered, nationalism, capitalism, communism, and so people are reaching for something which has been there for a long time, a sense of community, a sense of connection with the past, some way of envisioning a future that's better, and these ideas are encapsulated in the religious tradition.
A sense of community, a sense of tradition, a sense of the past, a sense of family. All these traditions are encapsulated, for example, in not modern way of life. As we told 2 days ago with some of our friends when we were discussing about some of the topics, modern life is really detrimental to human brain. Modern education, totalization in education has been proved to be detrimental to our cognitive reserves. The more you are accumulating narratives, the more you are being exposed to bits of information, the more you are being exposed to different kinds of bits of information in your daily lives, the more you are pumping into your ontology. Do you know what you are pumping into your ontology? Entropy, meaning disorder. In that famous law of thermodynamics, entropy on the highest level of the biological organisms, entropy on the highest level, when it reaches to the highest level of the biological organisms, death occurs. In recent months, a group of scientists made an analogy, a resemblance with our organizations, with our higher educational organizations, when, for example, they are applying some of the bureaucratic red tape, when they are adopting a bureaucratic red tape, bureaucratic exaggeration practices, by red tape, I mean bureaucratic exaggeration practices. Death occurs. Organizations are collapsing. Organizations are collapsing due to the fact that they actually have not the capacity to counter against any challenges. Challenges related with the internal individuals, the individual persons, the people who are having a world in themselves and ontology in themselves that can probably not be understood by the outer world, by any elements, educational elements of the outer world. 15 minutes. Our friends, show me 5 minutes.
Stop by and then questions.
Okay. The question put forward by a venerable teacher, professor, has been, I think, has found its answer where you go to the famous theology. The other members of the Congress, could you please make an intrusion whatsoever you want?
I have one question relating to the degradation of the mind. I had read a different study about how many universities were worried about the quality of PhD work in the next 10 to 15 years because they saw the influence of probably the unintended consequences of technology on the human mind and the capacity to think for long periods of time and to think deeply is in fact decreasing. And they're already seeing it in PhD work. What do you think the specific interaction is going on between human minds and technology that's decreasing our ability to think?
Believe it or not, before I came here, I wanted to highlight the point made by our friend. I don't know how to give my special thanks to my friend Peterson, who is dredging up such a kind of phenomenon to be discussed. Ladies and gentlemen, will you believe me if I tell you that in the last decade, the number of retracted papers in academia increased more than 100 times compared with the number of original studies conducted in the former decades? Let me put it again. Will you believe me? The number of the retracted on the grounds of plagiarism, retracted from publication on the grounds of plagiarism. Will you believe me? The number of the papers retracted from journals on the grounds of plagiarism increased more than 100 times if you make a comparison with 10 years ago. This is really a symptom of the collapse of academia. This is a symptom of the collapse of academia. Even in Harvard University, if you scroll along some of the journals, you will come to the realization that very eminent, formerly some people who were recognized as eminent scientists, their articles were retracted from publication. So this is one aspect. And the other, related with your question, some other responses to be made related with your question would be the fact that liberal economies made academia to be interrelated with mediocrity. This is a point made by some philosophers whom I read a couple of months ago. Liberal economies, neoliberalist tendencies in academia, unfortunately, made academia to be not only doomed to fail, but also to be mediocre. Another point, to be having some interrelation, or to have some interrelation. Another point which I believe it might have some interrelation with your question would be of course, technological advances made the old ways of pedagogies to be obsolete, to be primitive, to be obsolete, not absolute, to be obsolete, which means primitive. Some other thing which I myself have observed in the past couple of decades in academic environments, in academic state of affairs, is that there is a hierarchically characterized, how can we put possibly, master and slave dialectics. Master and slave dialectics, hierarchically characterized in our higher education institutions, is bringing about not only foreign language anxiety, delicately mentioned by our friends yesterday, but also some other anxieties on the part of juniors, on the part of our students, who are constantly developing aversion psychology, as I mentioned yesterday. Our students are constantly developing aversion psychology. They have got some fears and anxiety to have or to attain self-realization. Some other thing which I recently mentioned in some television program is that some of the works of arts and literature might probably not be recognized in the next couple of centuries by humanity. Let me put it there. Some of the works which might have highest artistic quality, some of the works which probably might possess the highest artistic quality may not be recognized by humanity due to the fact that mankind is devoid of enough intellectual capacity to appreciate, to delve into the ontological layers of these kinds of works. Gerçekten teşekkür ötesinde tebrik ediyorum sizi. I really appreciate you and your question for dredging up such kinds of information. The other things of ours.
We probably have time for at least one more question, I think. Yeah, we're getting close.
One more question.
Yeah, I think one more question with a good answer to it.
Yes.
One last question related to my previous question when you were asking me about the failed premise.
Could you please repeat that?
This is related to my previous question, which was about failed promise of modernism. In your response, you referred to Nietzsche and his famous quote, "God is dead." The question is, because we know that Nietzsche had big criticisms towards a specific religion, but in praising quotes for praising words for Islam, for example, in some of his works, right? And so what the idea of Nietzsche claiming God is dead and modernism problems, are these constrained to a specific European context, or can we generalize that and universalize those? If it's clear, that's my question.
I appreciate the manifestation or question you have made, actually. Thanks a lot for such an important point to be acknowledged. Nietzsche, on one occasion, in one of his famous works, says that Western civilization, characterized by some of the Western religions, are presupposing that there will be no life after we die away. There will be no life after we die away, they say. As you quite delicately mentioned, Nietzsche was trying to focus upon a particular context when he manifested that God is dead. If you listen to the other parts of episode, you would come to the realization that Holocaust is trying to make a special reference, a special emphasis to Islam, which is in the past couple of decades becoming flourished not even in the Eastern world, but also in the Western world, due to the fact that people are newly beginning to realize some of the points mentioned by some venerable scholars like you to the West, by some venerable scholars like you in the West. And after they have made such kinds of enlightenment, and in the words of Harvey Cox, a kind of renaissance, Islamic renaissance is being felt. The repercussions of an Islamic renaissance is not only being felt in the Eastern countries or Eastern world, but also in the Western world. I don't know how to thank to all of you for being so keen, and to our special thanks would directly go to the team of our television, the local television network, Şehrivan TV, and some other friends who for more than probably 1 hour has been keen on delving into my talks. Çok teşekkür ediyorum.